Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Controlling Critical Subcontractors in 2014, Regulatory Evolutions. My name is Sarah Steck, and I'm the Legal and Regulatory Director here at GMED North America, and I'll be talking to you today about the different sources you can look to when looking for guidance on how to control your critical subcontractors, as well as some ways you can start the process. As you all probably already know, the European Medical Device Regulatory Scheme is currently being rewritten. It's in the middle of the EU legislative procedures right now, and even more changes are expected before we have a final text. However, we already know that some points will survive the different legislative bodies' scrutiny, and one of those is the way that notified bodies audit manufacturers with respect to how manufacturers control their critical subcontractors. Now, manufacturers have always had to show that they control their critical suppliers and subcontractors, as described in the regulations. However, the regulations weren't particularly clear as to how a manufacturer could show control or how they should show control. The recommendation of 24 September 2013, as well as the new regulations that will be finalized in the coming years, spell out with much more specificity how notified bodies and manufacturers should approach the control of critical suppliers and subcontractors. Since we've received a lot of questions about it ourselves, we figured that we would make this webinar to explain where the control element comes from, the requirements, and what notified bodies will be looking for. As usual, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. While I'm talking, you can type your question either into the chat box or into the Q&A box that you see on your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. If we can't get to everyone, we'll save them and answer them in the coming week or so. Also, we'll publish the slides and send them to everyone who signed up for the webinar so that you have the slides as a reference. And with that, let's get started. Today, we're going to go over some background, explanations, and finish up with some tips that manufacturers can use to prepare if they're not there already. First, we'll go over why you or the manufacturers need to control the critical subcontractors in the first place, beyond the regulations that we have to. Second, we'll go over the specific requirements in both EN ISO 1345 and in the EU medical device regulations that cover controlling of critical subcontractors. Third, we'll examine the recommendation that came out this past September and take a deep look at its specifics as to what notified bodies have to look for when auditing manufacturers on this point. Finally, we'll talk about some ways that manufacturers can use to prepare both themselves and their subcontractors for the changing regulatory landscape. And with that introduction, let's move right along to why a medical device manufacturer would need to control their critical subcontractors in the first place. So before we get into why a medical device manufacturer would need to control their critical subcontractors, let's first make sure we're all on the same page. I know that we all seem to have different definitions of these terms, so let's set a baseline. The two definitions you see on your screen are taken from the MBOG Best Practice Guide, 2010-1. A supplier is an organization or a person that provides a product, service, or information, and which is outside the manufacturer's quality management system. A critical supplier is a supplier that delivers materials, components, or services that may influence the safety and performance of the device. In the scope of this webinar, at least, a supplier is the same as a subcontractor. And think of it this way. A subcontractor is someone to whom a manufacturer subcontracts a specific task, right? So then the subcontractor would be the one supplying the service. So a supplier isn't just the party that delivers goods, but they can also deliver services. Now, a quick note. Many of you may consider your notified body to be one of your suppliers, and that's okay. Here at L&E GMED, because we are as committed to quality as you are, we always have and will continue to dutifully complete those supplier information forms you send us. However, keep in mind that your notified body probably wouldn't be a critical supplier or subcontractor. This is because the notified body doesn't influence the safety and performance of the device. The notified body comes in to audit the different influences that you and your critical subcontractors and suppliers had on the safety and the performance of the device. but the notified body audit isn't an input for the device's safety and performance. So looking back at the definitions, we can see that a critical subcontractor supplies the critical products or services that a manufacturer needs for their device to comply with the regulatory requirements. If you're not sure who your critical subcontractors are, just remember that they do something or provide something that, if you didn't have it, your device may not be able to conform to the essential requirements of the Medical Devices Directive. For example, your sterilizer is a critical subcontractor because they provide sterilization services, without which manufacturers wouldn't be able to sell their sterile devices. Given the important jobs that the critical subcontractors do, it should be clear why a manufacturer would need to control them. First, it's a regulatory requirement. The directives say you have to, so you have to. Second, control of critical subcontractors helps to promote the safety of the device. For example, looking at your sterilizer, if you don't exercise at least a modicum of control over them, how do you know if your devices are actually being sterilized? This question has some pretty big implications for device and patient safety that a manufacturer would be on the hook for answering. Finally, by continuously exercising control over their subcontractors, manufacturers can manage their regulatory duties and stop problems before they start. Now that we know what critical suppliers and subcontractors are and why it's important to control them, let's look at the standard and regulatory requirements that medical device manufacturers meet when it comes to control. First, let's move to the requirements in EN ISO 13485. In EN ISO 13485, the clauses that talk about how a manufacturer would control their subcontractors are in the Purchasing Control Subsystem, or Section 7.4 of EN ISO 13485. At first blush, this may seem like a strange place to put subcontractor controls, especially when a subcontractor or supplier is performing services. But think about it this way. Regardless if the manufacturer receives goods or services from their critical supplier or subcontractor, the manufacturer would still pay for these things, right? So in this sense, even when the critical supplier supplies a service to the manufacturer is still purchasing something. Now, I should make an important distinction. A manufacturer can certainly subcontract tasks and services to a critical subcontractor. However, the manufacturer remains responsible for performing these tasks even if they are subcontracted. This means that even if a manufacturer subcontracts, say, manufacturing of a device from supply of parts through final assembly, the manufacturer retains the regulatory duties to supply parts and assemble a product that meets the essential requirements of the Medical Devices Directive. In this sense, a manufacturer can subcontract tasks, activities, or even products, but a manufacturer cannot subcontract or delegate away their regulatory duties, and that's true even if they don't physically perform them. Now, I should mention here, don't forget that your technical documentation, even if you do subcontract, manufacturing and sterilization and all of that, that's okay. But don't forget, you can't delegate away your regulatory responsibilities, and so your validation records do comprise part of your technical file. So that's just another way that manufacturers can show control, that they are controlling those critical subcontractors. So let's take a look at some of the pertinent clauses in Section 7.4. First, Section 7.4.1, states that the organization shall establish documented procedures to ensure that purchased product conforms to specified purchase requirements. In other words, a manufacturer should determine how they would choose their critical subcontractor, the criteria they would need to consider in order to make sure their product conforms, and set up procedures to ensure that the product or service they receive actually conforms to what they need in the first place. When a manufacturer applies the criteria they set to their choices of subcontractor or suppliers, it should be clear that they meet the requirements. Now keep in mind that the sole criteria of price is not sufficient to ensure that a medical device conforms to the regulatory requirements. So in this case, it shouldn't be true, rather, that the lowest bidder always wins. You should always have some more criteria on top of that. Section 7.4.1 also states that the type and extent of control applied to the supplier and the purchased product shall be dependent upon the effect of the purchased product on subsequent product realizations or the final product. So in other words, in making up the procedures to ensure that the product conforms to the specified requirements, the manufacturer should consider the importance of the product or service to the device's regulatory conformity and safety. You're not going to use the same set of procedures to evaluate how well your office cleaning crew empties the recycling bin as you are to validate your device's sterility after it comes back from the sterilizer. This is because there can be big differences between all of the different services and products that a manufacturer uses to manufacture their device, and not all of them warrant the full treatment, and that's okay. At the same time, though, some of them do need more controls, and it's important that manufacturers take that into account when making their procedures. Section 7.4.2 states that the organization shall ensure the adequacy of the specified purchase requirements prior to their communication with their supplier. So what does this mean? Essentially, this means that the manufacturer should make sure, on its end, that it knows all of the specifications the subcontractor needs to meet before communicating them with the subcontractor. It's the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure the supplier or subcontractor is meeting its requirements. Now, this includes product approval requirements. For example, if a person with specific qualifications is required to build a device, and procedures the subcontractor itself should have in place before starting. In some cases, like when a distributor is a critical subcontractor, the manufacturer also must make sure that the subcontractor performs its risk management tasks according to the manufacturer's requirements and specifications. So going back to section 7.4.1, it states that the records of the results of evaluations and any necessary actions arising from the evaluation shall be maintained. So basically, this means that a manufacturer must maintain the evaluations records of the evaluations they performed while choosing and then controlling their critical subcontractor. Now, on this slide, there's a note, which we'll revisit in a lot more detail later on when we talk about the recommendation. But since it ties in here, it's well worth talking about. So a manufacturer has to maintain the records of their evaluations. This means that there have to be evaluations in the first place that will generate the records that they maintain. There are a bunch of different ways that a manufacturer can evaluate their subcontractors, which of course depends on how they were chosen, what the subcontractor is doing for the manufacturer, and how critical the activity or product is to the device's conformity. Regardless of how it's done, the manufacturer must maintain the records of the evaluation. So jumping ahead to section 7.4.3, it states that the organization shall establish and implement the inspection or other activities necessary for ensuring that purchased product meets specified purchase requirements. So once the manufacturer has chosen a subcontractor, written their instructions, made sure that everyone understands them, implemented control measures over the subcontractor, the manufacturer also needs to make sure that they're actually getting what they asked for in the first place. I'm sure a lot of manufacturers know the feeling that they're playing the kindergarten game of telephone when they're giving the instructions to their subcontractor. They're not really sure what the final instruction is going to look like, and they're not really sure what they're going to get. This is not a good situation for the manufacturer to be in, as they are the ones with the final duty of conformity. So the manufacturer needs to have the procedures in place to ensure that they actually get what they wanted in the first place. In addition to the requirements in EN ISO 1345, the European Medical Devices Directive also requires that the manufacturer control their subcontractors, although in much more general terms, than in EN ISO 1345. Let's take a look. When we're talking about regulatory requirements, let's remember the main one. Manufacturers must meet or exceed the essential requirements that apply to their devices. Also, don't forget that the manufacturer has this requirement even if they subcontract the activity or product that corresponds to the essential requirement to someone else. So if a critical subcontractor doesn't do their job, it is still first and foremost, from a regulatory point of view, the manufacturer's responsibility for the defective device. Where the essential requirements apply to a device, the quality system requirements in the annexes of each directive apply to the manufacturer and the quality management system. Each directive has the same requirements for controlling critical subcontractors or suppliers. Since each directive has the same requirement, we can choose just one. Let's go to the MDD in Annex 2.3.2 sub B. This states that the manufacturer's QMS shall include an adequate description of the methods of monitoring the efficient operation, and in particular, the type and extent of control applied to the third party when a third party does the design, manufacture, and/or final inspection of a device. Now, right there, the directive picks out the three major processes that directly influence the device's conformity: the device process, the manufacturing process, and then the final inspection process. If a manufacturer has subcontracted out one or more of these processes, the manufacturer's QMS needs to include a description and how it will control the processes. Now, the directive doesn't say what an adequate description is, but for guidance, manufacturers can look to the procedures we talked about during the section on EN ISO 13485. If you don't usually use Annex 2 of the MDD, on this slide is where you can find that same language in the other medical devices directives. Now, don't forget, these are regulatory requirements, so manufacturers have to comply with these requirements in order to comply with the regulations. So far, we've gone over the different ways that control is described in both EN ISO 13485 and the Medical Devices Directive. However, this past September, the new recommendation that came into town, and it had a lot more specific language than either the directive or EN ISO 13485. Let's see what it had to say. So just real quick, before we get into the meat of the recommendation, I want to give you a quick interpretive note that will help you answer the question of what is my notified body going to want to see. When reading the recommendation, you'll notice that it's written as instructions to the notified body. You can use these as instructions as a way to figure out what your notified body is going to want to see or look for when auditing your quality management system. So that's an important note. That's one question that we get a lot. What are you going to want to see? And if you look to the recommendation, you'll get a lot of information about that. So definitely do that. So now getting into the meat of the recommendation, the requirements that a notified body must meet when auditing a manufacturer's quality management system are in Annex 2. So you don't even have to go and touch the super scary Annex 3 where all the stuff about the unannounced audits are. So don't worry, you can just look at Annex 2 without going over to Annex 3. This annex includes the clauses that direct how and what notified bodies are going to look at when examining a manufacturer's quality management system with regards to the manufacturer's critical suppliers and subcontractors. So let's take a look at them. There are a lot of requirements in Annex 2, and so we're just going to take a look at the ones that specifically call out a manufacturer's critical subcontractors. The first one is Annex 2.2. which states that the notified body's assessment of the manufacturer's quality management system should include audits on the premises of the manufacturer and, if this is also necessary to ensure control, on those of its critical subcontractors or of its crucial suppliers. The key word in this clause is control. The manufacturer must maintain, which is another key word, sufficient control of its critical subcontractors and suppliers. If they don't, the notified body will audit those subcontractors or suppliers. Now, I should make a quick aside here to answer one frequently asked question that we get. The question is, if my subcontractor is EN ISO 1345 certified by another notified body, does that mean you won't go audit them since they're already certified? If a notified body were to audit a manufacturer and determine that they would also need to audit their critical subcontractor, the notified body will go and audit actually the manufacturer from the critical subcontractor. So in other words, the manufacturer's notified body isn't auditing the subcontractor's quality management system. It's auditing the manufacturer. For example, do you remember those requirements in EN ISO 1345 about adequately communicating with your subcontractors? During the subcontractor audit, the notified body is auditing how adequate the manufacturer's communication is from the subcontractor's perspective. Now, this is fairly independent from the subcontractor's quality management system in the first place, and so this really wouldn't matter if the subcontractor is certified. So the quick answer to that question is yes. So moving on, Annex 2.6 states that the notified body should verify if the manufacturer's business organization is appropriate for ensuring the conformity of the quality management system and the manufacturer's medical devices. The key phrase here is ensuring that conformity. Do you remember how in Annex 2.3 of the MDD, there's the requirement about the methods of control? Well, if you read the whole clause, and not just what was on the slide, because I cut some things out for space, but go read the whole clause. You'll see a requirement to describe the business organization, including the third parties and their methods of control. A manufacturer can organize their business in a bunch of different ways, and all of those ways are perfectly fine. But the organization should be built in order to ensure the device's conformity. One of these ways is to monitor the quality system operations, including with regards to third parties. In other words, the manufacturer's business organization shouldn't get in the way of the manufacturer itself, ensuring the conformity of its own devices. Annex 2.13 states that the notified body should verify that the procedure regarding design and product development, including any change control procedures, are appropriate to ensure the compliance of the devices. The key phrase here, similar to in Annex 2.3, is ensure the compliance. This also goes to the EN ISO 1345 requirement that the manufacturer has the responsibility to ensure that they communicate all the device's requirements in such a way that the manufacturer can follow them and make a conforming device. This is true even across changes. If a manufacturer makes a design change to a device, their quality management system should be such that the manufacturer will get the change device at the end of the manufacturing process. This is where a lot of manufacturers have trouble with their contract manufacturers. A change is communicated, but the output doesn't match the input. So really try to avoid the game of telephone with your critical subcontractors and build your quality management system and procedures to really minimize it as much as you can. Now, I know that it's easier for me to say in my, ivory tower of a notified body, and it's hard for industry to do. I get that. But keep in mind that it's not impossible. So even in the same section later on in Annex 2.13, the recommendation states that the notified body should verify that the manufacturer controls the manufacturing environment and processes and ensure the conformity of the device with the legal requirements. The key word in this clause is, again, control. Control of the processes and the manufacturing environment. So what exactly are we talking about in terms of manufacturing environment? For example, if your device needs to be produced in a clean room, or if it needs a specific kind of equipment to solder two parts together, you need to make sure that your contract manufacturer not only has this equipment, but uses it when manufacturing your device. Now, you'll always hear of horror stories where a manufacturer contracts out manufacturing of a high-risk device. It needs to be manufactured in a clean room and, with very tight controls and all of that. And everything goes fine with all the paperwork and the communication until the manufacturer decides to do an audit and pulls up to the address of the factory And it's actually a totally open-air factory with things like mold and rodents and stray animals and stray cats and screaming children and mosquitoes and bugs and flowers and dirt all over the factory floor with no mechanical ventilation in sight. So in other words, not a clean room or any definition of either of those in any situation. In this case, the manufacturer doesn't actually have control of its manufacturing process until it's pulled up and hopefully immediately stops production. The outcome of that scenario should trigger corrective actions like finding a new contract manufacturer and even preventative actions like re-examining the criteria for contract manufacturers and the process by which the contract manufacturer was chosen in the first place. Annex 2.15 states that notified bodies need to verify the manufacturer's system ensuring traceability of materials and components from the entry into the manufacturer's, suppliers, or subcontractor's premises to the delivery of the final product. The key word here is traceability. And by traceability, we mean traceability all the way down to the raw materials. Annex 2.15 also states that the manufacturer should check the coherence between the quantity of raw materials needed against the quantity of finished product. So in other words, if a manufacturer orders 2 gallons of raw material in order to make 20 devices, the subcontractor should be able to produce 20 devices at the end. If there aren't 20 devices, then maybe there's an issue with the raw material or the subcontractor's instructions, like if they're using too much or too little. Regardless, it's the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that this problem is fixed. So now that we've gone through the requirements in a bit more detail, what can a manufacturer do to prepare for any changes that they may see from their notified body with respect to their control of their critical subcontractors or suppliers? Now, the first thing before your notified body shows up is to do a gap analysis between where you are and where you should be. Take a look at the requirements in the regulations and in the ISO 1345, and then really take a look at your quality management procedures and their output, including how they are actually performed. And sometimes what's on paper isn't always reality. It's easy in this instance to take a bit of a shortcut, be an ostrich, and stick your head in the sand. But trust me, that's how problems can really take hold. And how do you know if you have problems in the first place if you don't do a gap analysis? In addition to a gap analysis, another good idea for a manufacturer is to perform an internal audit to identify points of weakness. Here's another opportunity to be an ostrich, but trust me, it almost never works out. If you need to think of it in another way, think of it as a character building exercise, like the ones that Calvin's dad gave him. They may not be particularly fun while they're happening, but they can lead to a better functioning and more mature person or quality management system. For your internal audits, don't forget about your complaint processes and how well it feeds into your change procedures. Once you've performed your gap analysis and internal audits and identified areas to improve, start a conversation with your critical subcontractor. If you realize that some of your work instructions weren't clear, work with your critical subcontractor to see how you could make them more clear. Or maybe your critical subcontractor doesn't realize just how important one part is to your device's regulatory conformity, and you need to make sure that they do understand. In my experience, conversation can really go a long way. Even before you start a conversation, you may also want to perform an internal audit on your critical subcontractors, even if you've never done one before. Yes, they're a bit dear. However, you can establish a baseline for your gap analysis and use it as a jumping off point for future conversations and audits. Conveniently, internal audits are a control method too, as long as you keep up with the corrective and preventative actions that your critical subcontractor has to do. And with that, it looks like our time is almost at an end. So today, we've gone over the requirements in EN ISO 1345 and the Medical Devices Directive for controlling a manufacturer's critical subcontractors, as well as the specifics that are called out in the recommendation that was published this past September. Finally, I pointed out a few methods that you can use to get started on making sure that your quality management system is running as required in the standards and regulations.